Hello. Welcome to tonight's bedtime story by Lucid Tales. I hope your day has been kind and full of love. But whether it has been deep, cool forest or scorched sand for you, it's time to relax now. Find somewhere comfortable, maybe your bed or a favourite armchair, and make sure you're ready for sleep. Take your shoes off if you can, and feel the freedom in your toes, the little loosening that means it's time for bed. Tonight's story is an English tale of the fairy Yallery Brown. Once upon a time, and a very good time it was, though it wasn't in my mother's time, nor in mine, nor in your time, nor in anyone else's time, there was a young farm boy of 18, named Tom, hardly working, on a broad, wide farm. You see, young Tom was as lazy as they come, and never turned his hand to a day's work if he could avoid it. One fine June day, skiving off work, he was walking across the west field and decided to turn into the fairy woods. Now, Tom had been warned about the fairy woods since he was a bairn. No one, not even a little child, would dare enter the woods alone, and especially not so close to Midsummer's Day, when the magic of the fae was at its peak. But the day was warm and still, and Tom was all sleepy with sunshine. And after all, no one sensible believed in fairies anymore, and even if they were real, they could hardly begrudge old Tom a peaceful nap. The air was full of little sounds, as though the trees and grass were gossiping amongst themselves. As he walked, he noticed a sound, growing louder and louder, a sort of pitiful sobbing, like a bairn spent with fear, breaking off into a moan and then rising again in a long, whimpering wailing that made him feel sick to hear it. He began to look everywhere for the poor creature that was making such a terrible racket, but though he looked and looked, he could find nothing. The whimpering got louder and stronger in the quietness, and Tom listened with all his might. He thought he could make out words all mixed up with the sobbing. "Oh, the nasty stone, the great big stone. The stone's on top, it's so heavy." Naturally, he wondered where the stone might be, and he looked again. And there, at the roots of a gnarled old rowan tree, was a great, flat stone, nigh buried in the mools and moss, tangled in the cotted grass and weeds. Down he fell on his knee-bones by that stone and hearkened again. Clearer than ever, but tired and spent with crying, came the little sobbing voice. "Oh, the stone on top." Tom was wary, and misliking to meddle with the thing, but he couldn't stand to hear the whimpering so like a babby, and he tore like mad at the stone till he felt it lifting from the mools and moss, and all at once it came out with a sough out of the damp earth and the tangled grass and growing things. And there in the hole lay a tiddy little thing on its back, blinking up at the sun and at him. It was no bigger than a year-old babby, but it had long cotted hair and beard, twisted round and round its body so that you couldn't see its clothes, and the hair was all yellow and shining and silky like a bairn's. But the face of it was old and wrinkled, as if it had been hundreds of years since it was young and smooth. Just a heap of wrinkles, and two bright black eyes in the midst, set in a lot of shining yellow hair, and the skin was the colour of the fresh-turned earth in the spring, brown as brown could be, and its bare hands and feet were brown like the face of it. The crying had stopped, but the tears were standing on its cheek, and the tiddy weird thing looked all bemused in the sunshine and warm air. The creature looked up in Tom's face, as bold as ever was. "Tom," says he, "thou art a good lad." As cool as you can think, says he, "Tom, thou art a good lad." And his voice was soft and high and piping like a little bird twittering. Tom shrank back. "How do you know my name?" he asked. "Oh," says the thing, "thou needn't be afeard of me. Thou'st done me better than I deserve, and I'll do as much for thee." This must be a bogle, thought Tom in the silence of his mind, shrinking back in fear. "No," says he, as quick, "a bogle I am not. It's been many a long old tiresome day since they stuck me in the grot. But you'd best not ask me what I be. Let bogles be forgot. I'll anyhow be friend to thee, the best one that you've got." Poor Tom's legs went all a-quiver. His knees started to shake. For what could know his very thoughts before he'd spoken them aloud? But, he thought, all was not lost. To keep a fairy tame, one must only know its true name. If he could find its name, perhaps he could still escape. It said, pulling its beard. "As for that, I so. Yallery Brown mayst call me, the name by which I go. Yallery Brown it is my name, and as a name not bad. Yallery Brown, Tom. Yallery Brown's a friend to thee, my lad." As poor Tom's face went pale as pale, Yallery Brown smiled. "To show ye my deepest gratitude, I shall help thee." "That's mighty kind of you," said Tom, though terror held him stuck. "So what'll it be?" asked Yallery Brown. "A wife and wealth and child? I'll give you gold a-plenty, enough to fill a sack. You'll barely walk a mile or two with that upon your back." Now these things tempted our young Tom, and nigh on chased the fear right out of his head. But Tom an idle coward was, and knew that even such fine-sounding gifts could become a penance. "Yallery Brown, that all sounds very well, but I don't want any of that. My gold they'll rob, my wife will sob, it sounds too much like work." "But," he said, a keen glint coming into his lazy blue eye, "if you could do my work for me, that I would be grateful for, and thank you kindly too." "Stop!" snapped Yallery, quick as lightning. "I'll help thee, and thou'st welcome, but if ever thou sayest that to me, if ever thou thankest me, thou'lt never see me more. Mind that now. I want no thanks. I'll have no thanks." And he stamped his tiddy foot on the earth and looked as wicked as a raging bull. "Mind that now, great lamp that thou be," he went on, calming down a bit. "And if ever thou needst help, or getst into trouble, call on me, and just say, 'Yallery Brown, come from the mools, I want thee,' and I'll be with ye at once. And now," says he, picking a dandelion puff, "good night to thee." And he blowed it up, and it all came into Tom's eyne and ears. As soon as Tom could see again, the tiddy creature was gone, and but for the stone on end and the hole at his feet, he'd have thought he'd been dreaming. Well, Tom went home and to bed, and by the morning he'd nigh forgot all about it. But when he went to the work, there was none to do. All was done already, the horses seen to, the stables cleaned out, everything in its proper place, and he'd nothing to do but sit with his hands in his pockets. And so it went on, day after day, all the work done by Yallery Brown, and better done too than he could have done it himself. And if the master gave him more work, he sat down, and the work did itself. The singeing irons, or the broom, or what not, set to, and with ne'er a hand put to it, would get through in no time. For he never saw Yallery Brown in daylight. Only in the darklins he saw him hopping about, like a will-o'-the-wyke without his lantern. At first 'twas mighty fine for Tom. He'd naught to do and good pay for it. But by and by things began to grow vicey-varsy. If the work was done for Tom, 'twas undone for the other lads. If his buckets were filled, theirs were upset. If his tools were sharpened, theirs were blunted and spoiled. If his horses were clean as daisies, theirs were splashed with muck, and so on. Day in and day out 'twas the same. Day in and day out 'twas the same. And the lads saw Yallery Brown flitting about o' the nights, and they saw the things working without hands o' days. and they saw that Tom's work was done for him, and theirs undone for them. And naturally they began to look shy on him, and they wouldn't speak or come nigh him, and they carried tales to the master, and so things went from bad to worse. For Tom could do nothing himself. The brooms wouldn't stay in his hand, the plough ran away from him, the hoe kept out of his grip. He thought that he'd do his own work after all, so that Yallery Brown would leave him and his neighbours alone. But he couldn't. True as death he couldn't. He could only sit by and look on, and have the cold shoulder turned on him while the unnatural thing was meddling with the others and working for him. At last things got so bad that the master gave Tom the sack, and if he hadn't, all the rest of the lads would have sacked him, for they swore they'd not stay on the same garth with Tom. Well, naturally Tom felt bad. 'Twas a very good place, and good pay too, and he was fair mad with Yallery Brown as had got him into such a trouble. So Tom shook his fist in the air and called out as loud as he could, "Yallery Brown, come from the mools, thou scamp! I want thee!" You'll scarce believe it, but he'd hardly brought out the words, but he felt something tweaking his leg behind, while he jumped with the smart of it. And soon as he looked down, there was the tiddy thing, with his shining hair and wrinkled face and wicked, glinting black eye. Tom was in a fine rage, and he would have liked to have kicked him, but 'twas no good, there wasn't enough of it to get his boot against. But he said, "Look here, master, I'll thank thee to leave me alone after this, dost hear? I want none of thy help, and I'll have naught more to do with thee. See now." The horrid thing broke into a screeching laugh and pointed its brown finger at Tom. "Oh, Tom," says he, "thou'st thanked me, my lad, and I told thee not, I told thee not." "I don't want thy help, I tell thee," Tom yelled at him. "I only want to never see thee again and to have naught more to do with thee. Thou can go." The thing only laughed and screeched and mocked as long as Tom went on swearing, but so soon as his breath gave out, "Tom, my lad," he said with a grin, "I'll tell 'ee summat, Tom. True's true, I'll never help thee again, and call as thou wilt, thou'll never see me after today. But I never said I'd leave thee alone, Tom. And I never will, my lad. I was nice and safe under the stone, Tom, and could do no harm. But thou let me out thyself, and thou can't put me back again. I would have been thy friend and worked for thee if thou'd been wise. But since thou be'st no more than a born fool, I'll give thee no more than a born fool's luck. And when all goes vicey-varsy, and everything agee, thou'lt mind that it's Yallery Brown's doing, though m'appen thou doesn't see him. Mark my words." And he began to sing, dancing round Tom like a bairn with his yellow hair, but looking older than ever with his grinning, wrinkled bit of a face. "Work as thou will, thou'lt never do well. Work as thou mayst, thou'lt never gain grist. For harm and mischance and Yallery Brown, thou'st let out thyself from under the stone." Tom could never rightly mind what he said next. It was all cussing and calling down misfortune on him. But he was so mazed in fright that he could only stand there shaking all over and staring down at the horrid thing. And if he'd gone on long, Tom would have tumbled down in a fit. But by and by, his yaller hair shining rose up into the air, and wrapped itself around him till he looked for all the world like a great dandelion puff, and it floated away on the wind over the wall and out of sight with a parting skirl of wicked voice and sneering laugh. "And did it come true, sayest thou? My word, but it did, sure as death. Tom worked here, and he worked there, and turned his hand to this and to that, but it always went agee, and 'twas all Yallery Brown's doing. And the children died, and the crops rotted, the beasts never fatted, and nothing ever did well with him. Until he was dead and buried, and m'appen even afterwards, there was no end to Yallery Brown's spite at him. Day in and day out he used to hear him saying, 'Work as thou will, thou'lt never do well. Work as thou mayst, thou'lt never gain grist. For harm and mischance and Yallery Brown, thou'st let out thyself from under the stone.' So if you should ever be walking out in the woods, one lazy, warm and dusty day, close to midsummer, and you should happen to hear a crying voice, wailing and lamenting from beneath a great stone, coaxing and wheedling, don't stop to listen. Don't lift the stone. Walk on by and thank yourself for it. For Yallery Brown is a wicked mischief creature, and will do no good to thee. Good night. Sleep well, and I will see you soon for another bedtime story.